Okay, so I've just been telling everyone like this series is around colorism, but we're interviewing different people from different perspectives, different like interests, passions, their journeys are all different. So in interviewing you, I don't want you to ever feel like you gotta kind of say what you think people want to hear, or in terms of like the
Hmm.
PC answer. Like even if it's like I've never experienced colorism, that's a valuable, valid contribution to this conversation. So definitely, I'm going to weave in a little bit around kind of like the work that you do and kind of how that impacts your perspective. But feel
Hmm.
free to just whatever feels authentic to you. At the end of the day, it's
Okay.
kind of just having your perspective added to this conversation. And
Hmm.
I'm gonna, after I ask you a question, I'm gonna just mute myself so that I don't add any background noise. But I'm here, I'm listening, but it might sound a little quiet because I'm just unmuted so that you can talk. Um,
Gotcha.
but yes, all right. So let's get started. Okay. So the first question that I've just been asking everyone is, obviously we thought it was worth kind of like bringing up this conversation. So I'm curious, from your perspective, do you feel like the Black community has kind of moved past colorism?
No, I mean, it's like kind of like even our own people, we can kind of be our own downfall. And what we choose to co-sign or subscribe, I feel like is a direct reflection of that. And it often does evolve around colorism, like even within these different creative spaces we're in, especially within the music industry, which is one of the spaces that I'm in. I often feel that women of a darker tone who are just as talented really don't get the same opportunities forwarded to a woman that may be lighter skinned, who also has like pretty privilege, who may not have as much talent, So it's like, how do they determine these things? And a lot of times, when you are lighter skinned to, America's standards of beauty and also the world, it seems like a more diverse marketing asset. So a lot of these artists are treated as products, they think about, can she appeal to the white audience? Can she appeal to our global audience? Can she get makeup deals and things like that? But I feel like we're the curators of what's cool. So we have to have brands and we have to have companies and organize ourselves to start to shift that narrative more. I see it happening more and more, but I also feel like it's polarizing. It's like even when we are seeing a darker skinned woman, she's still almost used as some sort of like product or some sort of like token Black girl, so to speak. It's like, your Blackness is perfect for our campaign because that's what's trending versus, no, you're just beautiful, So I do think that we are a big part of that and how we even curate our own experiences within our culture.
That is so real. You like touch on half the stuff I was going to ask you about, which is awesome. And I'm curious,
Mm.
like as I'm listening to you talk, do you feel like, especially within the music industry, darker skinned women
Mm.
kind of have to do more, or like there's a heavier expectation on them to kind of succeed?
Oh, absolutely. I would say women in general also, but I think women of color definitely get a harder we get more struggle, we get more challenges, and it's the standards are so higher than the typical, person, because it's like we just can't be who we are sometimes. We always have to show up perfect. And if we make a mistake, it's like, oh, I already knew that was going to happen. They already have a set of rules for us, or a set of these preconceived notions of what we're going to be. Like I've just experienced that on a directing project. Like, I'm in meetings and there's majority of like, white men, and it's like when I would speak, sometimes my thoughts would go unaddressed or responded, but then a white counterpart could say something, male counterpart, by the way, can say something. And then it's like, he just said what I said. Like, and everyone's like, that's such a great idea. So I almost felt like in those situations, I just faded to the back because, I feel like, when you're new to this industry, it's almost like you're trying to prove yourself of your greatness to people because they may not necessarily have seen your light yet, but you're the light in the room, and you're bringing innovative ideas in the room, and you have to sometimes yield your personality just to kind of be able to work and navigate these spaces. So that's kind of been one of the things that I feel like I've had challenges with, even currently, like presently.
Yeah. Have there been any like within the music industry, even just like being somebody who is like very publicly visible, have you had any experiences that kind of to you were like, okay, this is directly, or like this is colorism, or like have you ever in your experience like felt this, like identified a moment as being like a very like colorist experience?
Let me think about that. I don't know if I've experienced it per se. I've experienced things that evolved around my image, like early on in my career. Like if you go on YouTube and look up a lot of my older content, I had more of this like edgy look. Like I had a mohawk with my natural hair. I was rocking my natural hair. You know, I had producers say to the manager I had at the time that they wouldn't want to work with me because they're not attracted to me. And then my response was like, well, I don't want to work with them either if that's how they feel. So it's like, I feel like I've seen it with a lot of my peers. You know, I've seen them actually have to deal with this. And they're so just in a space where it affects their confidence. And, you know, I just try to like ensure them that you are amazing and that you have to work the hardest. And look at people like Missy Elliott. You know, she came out at a time where being plus size, being brown skin, and you want to rap and sing, like, what is this? But she really, really made her own lane. And she really said, I don't care about that. I know who I am, and I'm going to continue to go hard because I want to go hard for myself. And so I just try to like, when I see those types of things happening within the world we're in, and I have close friends who are experiencing it, I really feel for them and empathize with them. And that's really why I started my woman focused record label with a specific with a specific focus on women of color, because we just don't get afforded the same opportunities. And it's a lot of times because people are overlooking the talent. They're overlooking and they don't have a bigger scope of what is being presented in front of them. Like if we give people more opportunities who have a more diverse and unique approach to music, to art, like imagine just the expansion of the representation that we would have. And that's one of my main missions right now with my woman focused record label, Club Queen Records.
That's fire. I didn't even know you had a record label. You were literally doing everything. You
Yeah,
do it
we just
all.
turned 3 years old this
Wow,
year.
that's awesome. That's really
Mhm.
awesome. So like for me, while my dad is from Baltimore, my mother, I grew up in like Virginia. And my family's from like North Carolina. So
Mhm.
colorism was something growing up that like I heard all the time. There's just so many little isms and things that were said to me, or even just like in school, where I kind of thought every city was like that. And I'm really curious, were you born and raised in Baltimore, or did you move there from a different place?
I was born and raised in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay.
And when I was 18, I moved to Baltimore to attend the Maryland Institute College of Art. So I studied art and got my bachelor's in fine arts and with a concentration in video production. You know, at the time, video was a new medium being brought to the world in terms of us being able to create our own video and cinema.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I thought it was a very interesting medium that I could like combine all of my talents, you know, art, music, and, you know, visual. So that's when I moved to Baltimore. I was 18 years old and I spent about 10 to 12 years, 2 years I was in New York. I was in Brooklyn.
Oh,
And I
wow.
feel like, yeah, I feel like in Brooklyn and being in New York, that's where I got my hustle from. Like, I feel like I was literally working like, working 3 jobs, 7 days a week, from retail to working at a smoothie bar at Equinox Gym. And then I was working at this like trade show fashion magazine.
Mhm.
And it was like just living in different worlds. And I also had a chance to intern at MTV. So it was like, I had this vision for myself. And I thought, I was like, I'm going to work for MTV once I graduate college. And it was crazy because I had a few interviews. And one of the interviews I had was like for a position, like an entry level position. And the person hiring me literally told me, I just don't think there's growth for you in this position.
Mm.
So that's when my life masterclass began, because it kind of catapulted me into just like DIY and just going for what I wanted and what I envisioned for myself. And I feel like my life experiences have been so much more valuable than even just getting these like work experiences in these offices. It's like I
Mhm.
literally had to just throw myself out there and trial and error and learn everything. So yeah, that's kind of like my background and where I started and where I came from.
That's dope. That's really dope. And so you that was when you the time you were in New York that you were that the 2 years you said you were in New York, you were working for Viacom.
Well, no, my junior year of college is when I interned for
Oh,
Viacom.
okay, cool. That's fire. That's so dope. Um,
Yeah.
let's see. Okay, so I want to rewind a little bit. So I'm really curious, just because like I'm always just like trying to understand what other people's experiences were like. So living in Florida, I'm really curious, like how people viewed color and like skin tone and stuff there versus transitioning to Baltimore. Because I have some ideas in my head of like kind of how people feel about, darker skin tones in Baltimore, but I'm just really curious, like what was your experience?
Well, in Florida, it's the South, even though Fort Lauderdale and Miami are very modern, and that's where the city life is. But if you go
Mhm.
a couple hours up, you in Jacksonville and Tallahassee and Tampa, it's like the country, it's dirt roads, it's next to Georgia. So it's like, when I grew up in Florida, I lived a very sheltered life. So I grew up with a Pentecostal background. I wasn't allowed to wear skirts and things. So I was experiencing it from different sides. So it's like one thing being a Black girl, but another thing being this like Black girl in school that has to wear skirts below your knees. And it was just all these restrictions. But I grew up around a very diverse culture in Florida because you had these communities that, you had Haitian, Cuban, and I feel like I saw the color line when it came to Haitians and Hispanics. It was like to be Haitian was almost like this thing that had a negative connotation to it. It was really sad, actually. Like, I really felt like, why? Like, no one ever explained why we feel this way about Haitian culture. And when I got older, I just was like, that was wrong. Like, that's not cool. Like, we all are people. We all are part of the African diaspora. Like, we have to understand our different communities and our brothers and sisters. And so, like, growing up in Florida, you definitely in the South. And I remember my grandmother just like always, like, she didn't really like white people. A lot of older people in Florida, they just do not like white people. Like, they are not for it. That because you in the South, so it's a little different. I feel like in New York, it's there. But when I moved to New York, I didn't feel it as much because New York is just like this one big melting pot. But definitely coming from Florida, like, you see that color line for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. I felt the same thing when I came to New York. I was like, oh, this is beautiful. We all just like celebrating everybody out here. And like,
Mhm.
that was like very refreshing for me to have that experience. And I'm curious, and I have no idea if this is true or not, but to me as an outsider looking in within like the Baltimore club dance scene, it almost kind of feels like this like escape from like all the anti-blackness and everything that's going on. Like it to me, when I like watch your film and like when I just see footage of people dancing, it seems like kind of like a space to kind of just be yourself where like colors was probably like the last thing that you'd be thinking
Mhm.
about. Is that true or is that just an assumption?
I would say so. Like, you go to Baltimore, it's really about community. Baltimore, you can see all of Baltimore in one day. You know what I'm saying? You can go downtown, then hit Baltimore Street, then go to Station North, be in, all these different areas, east, west. And, there's these spaces that we come together. And when you go into those spaces, you see a full range of community. And so that's one thing that I learned in Baltimore was how important community was and building your community and helping the young people. When I was in Baltimore, I was doing more nonprofit work as a media specialist and art instructor for local nonprofits that were putting after school programs that had art programs in schools that didn't have art programs. So we would go after school and I would teach music production and film production to young kids. And so really being in Baltimore really connecting me in my philanthropy side to just community. And that's what Baltimore Club was about. I saw kids as young as 1 and 2 dancing, and I seen our elders as old as 60 and up to dancing to the club music. And that's what attracted me to the sound. And it also felt nostalgic for me because I grew up on a lot of 90s dance music and Miami bass, like Uncle Luke, Two Live Crew, Quad City DJs. And so I felt like that's where I really, really found my voice as an artist was in Baltimore.
That's beautiful. Okay, so I want to ask you now, as someone who is like a filmmaker and a storyteller, do you think that we can use these mediums to kind of like counteract things like colorism in terms of how we tell stories about Blackness? And like, how do you think we can do that?
Absolutely. I think it's so important when you have a platform to find your voice in that platform. I feel like my voice in my space is definitely being about women empowerment and showing representation of marginalized groups, LGBTQ. Like, I feel that I want to create a space where we can see the positivity in these groups and show more